The evening air hung thick with the promise of autumn on that September night in 2009, carrying with it the sweet scent of harvested corn and the distant sound of crickets chirping their nocturnal symphony. In the small farming community of Beason, Illinois, a dot on the map so tiny that most people couldn't find it even if they tried, families were settling into their evening routines. Children were being tucked into warm beds, kitchen lights were dimming, and the peaceful rhythm of rural life was winding down as it had for generations before. But for one family, the Geurins, this would be their final peaceful evening together. As the sun disappeared behind the endless expanse of Illinois farmland, casting long shadows across their property on the edge of town, none of them could have imagined that a predator was already stalking through the darkness toward their home. By sunrise, 5 members of this loving family would be dead, their blood painting the walls of what had once been a sanctuary of warmth and laughter. Beason, Illinois, exists in that forgotten America where everybody knows everybody, where unlocked doors are the norm rather than the exception, and where the most exciting thing that happens on any given week might be the high school football game or the annual corn festival. With a population hovering around just 200 souls, it's the kind of place where children can ride their bikes safely down gravel roads, where neighbors wave from their front porches, and where the biggest worry most families face is whether the crops will survive an unexpected storm. The town sits roughly 200 miles from the bustling chaos of Chicago, but it might as well be on another planet. Here, the landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, rolling hills carpeted with corn and soybeans, punctuated occasionally by weathered barns and farmhouses that have stood sentinel for decades. The closest thing to civilization is Lincoln, Illinois, about a 20-minute drive away, where residents go when they need a Walmart, a proper hospital, or any of the modern conveniences that small-town life can't provide. It was in this peaceful, trusting community that Rick Geurin had chosen to build his life and raise his growing family. Rick was a man carved from the bedrock of Midwestern values, hardworking, dependable, and fiercely devoted to those he loved. In his early 30s, he possessed that particular brand of quiet strength that comes from years of physical labor and the satisfaction of building something meaningful with your own 2 hands. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the honest lines of a man who had never shied away from hard work, and his calloused palms told the story of countless hours spent wielding hammers, saws, and the tools of his trade. Rick's journey to Beason had begun years earlier when he worked for his stepfather's construction company in Lincoln. His stepfather, known to everyone simply as Pudge, had taken Rick under his wing and taught him the fundamentals of the construction business. But Rick possessed an entrepreneurial spirit that couldn't be contained within someone else's vision. He dreamed of something bigger, something that belonged entirely to him, a legacy he could pass down to his children. Every dollar Rick earned went toward that dream. While other men his age might have spent their evenings at the local bar or their weekends at the lake, Rick was busy squirreling away every penny, planning and preparing for the day when he could strike out on his own. His discipline and determination finally paid off when he managed to purchase a piece of property on the outskirts of Beason, a ranch-style home with a 2-car detached garage, an above-ground pool that sparkled in the summer sun, and enough farmland to keep chickens and other livestock. The house itself was modest but solid, the kind of home that promised comfort and stability rather than luxury. Its low-slung profile sat naturally against the landscape, as if it had grown from the earth itself. The wraparound porch invited visitors to sit and stay a while, and the large windows offered views of the endless sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. For Rick, it represented everything he had worked toward: independence, security, and a place where his family could thrive. With his new property secured, Rick took the bold step of launching GC Construction, his own company that would specialize in the kind of honest, reliable work that rural communities desperately needed. It was a risky move, starting a business always is, but Rick had the skills, the work ethic, and the reputation to make it succeed. Still, the financial pressures of homeownership and entrepreneurship meant that every dollar mattered, which led to his decision to rent out one of the spare rooms in his home. That decision would change the trajectory of his life forever, though not in the way he initially imagined. When Ruth Constant responded to his rental advertisement, Rick had no idea that he was about to meet the woman who would become the center of his world. Ruth arrived at his doorstep with 2 small children in tow, 3-year-old Justina, whose bright eyes sparkled with curiosity about everything around her, and 1-year-old Dylan, who was just beginning to explore the world on unsteady legs. Ruth Constant was the kind of woman who could light up a room simply by walking into it. Her warm, infectious personality drew people to her like moths to a flame, and her sense of humor could diffuse tension and bring laughter to even the most stressful situations. She had faced her share of challenges as a single mother. Raising 2 young children was never easy, especially when you're trying to make ends meet, but Ruth approached life with an optimism and resilience that was genuinely inspiring. What began as a simple landlord-tenant relationship between Rick and Ruth quickly blossomed into something much deeper. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, a connection that went beyond mere attraction. Rick, who had been focused so intently on building his business and securing his future, found himself drawn to Ruth's warmth and vivacity. She, in turn, was attracted to his stability, his kindness, and the way he treated her children not as burdens but as blessings. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of rural Illinois life. Long conversations on the front porch as the sun set over the fields, family dinners around the kitchen table with Justina chattering about her day and baby Dylan babbling from his high chair, quiet moments stolen after the children were asleep when they could truly focus on each other. It was a love story rooted in. When Ruth discovered she was pregnant in 1997, it felt like the natural next step in their journey together. They were married that same year, with Rick at 34 and Ruth at 27, both of them ready to fully commit to the blended family they were creating. The wedding was a simple affair, surrounded by family and friends who could see the genuine love and happiness radiating from the couple. For Rick, it meant gaining not just a wife but 2 children he would love and raise as his own. For Ruth, it meant security, partnership, and the chance to build the stable family life she had always dreamed of. Their first biological child together, Austin, arrived as a bright, energetic little boy who seemed to embody the best qualities of both his parents. He had Rick's thoughtful nature and Ruth's infectious smile, and from the moment he could walk, he was following his father around the property, fascinated by the tools and machinery of the construction business. Austin was the kind of child who asked a million questions, who wanted to understand how everything worked, who possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. A year later, their family grew again with the arrival of Jessica Geurin, a beautiful baby girl who filled their hearts with even more joy. But their happiness was tempered by the discovery that Jessica had been born with serious neurological conditions that would require specialized, round-the-clock care. For Rick and Ruth, it was a devastating blow, not because they loved their daughter any less, but because they quickly realized that their rural location and limited resources would make it impossible to provide Jessica with the care she desperately needed. The decision to place Jessica in a specialized facility 50 miles away in Peoria was agonizing. No parent should ever have to make such a choice, but Rick and Ruth knew it was the only way to ensure their daughter received the medical attention she required. Jessica became a temporary ward of the state, and though they visited her as often as possible, the separation was a constant ache in their hearts. Tragically, Jessica would pass away well before the horrific events that would eventually tear their family apart, leaving Rick and Ruth to grieve not only her loss but the dreams they had harbored for their daughter's future. Meanwhile, Dylan, Ruth's son from her previous relationship, was growing into a spirited, energetic boy who seemed to contain more energy than his small body could reasonably hold. He was the kind of child who could turn a quiet afternoon into an adventure, who saw possibility and excitement in everything around him. But his boundless energy sometimes manifested in ways that concerned his teachers and frustrated his parents. Behavior reports came home from school with increasing frequency, detailing incidents where Dylan had trouble sitting still, following directions, or controlling his impulses. Rick and Ruth refused to simply dismiss these concerns as boys being boys. They sought professional help for Dylan, eventually receiving a diagnosis of ADHD that finally provided an explanation for his behavioral challenges. With the diagnosis came therapy sessions and strategies for helping Dylan channel his energy in more productive directions. While the therapy helped somewhat, it wasn't a magic solution, and Rick and Ruth continued to work tirelessly to help their son succeed both at home and at school. Despite these challenges, there were bright spots on the horizon. Rick's daughter Nicole from his previous relationship had grown into a beautiful, capable young woman who brought her own joy to the family dynamic. At 18, she had fallen in love with Christopher Harris, a 21-year-old local man who seemed charming and attentive. Their relationship moved quickly from dating to marriage, and they settled into a home just a minute's walk from Rick's property, creating a close-knit family compound where multiple generations could support and care for each other. When Nicole and Christopher welcomed their first child, little Elisa Harris, Rick and Ruth were thrilled to become grandparents. The arrival of a new generation seemed to cement the bonds that held their extended family together. Ruth, in particular, loved caring for Elisa when Nicole and Christopher were at work, and the little girl brought a special light to the household. She was followed 2 months later by another baby, expanding their family circle even further and creating new sources of joy and purpose for everyone involved. By the late summer of 2009, the Geurin family seemed to have found their rhythm. Rick's construction business was thriving, providing steady income and the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands. Ruth had embraced her role as the heart of their household, managing the complex logistics of a large family while maintaining the warmth and humor that made their home such a welcoming place. The children were growing and developing their own personalities. Austin at 11 was becoming more helpful around the property, 14-year-old Dylan was finding better ways to manage his ADHD with continued therapy and support, and 16-year-old Justina was blossoming into a beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The youngest member of their household was 3-year-old Tabitha, Dylan's little sister, who had become the absolute darling of the family. With her cherubic face and infectious giggle, she could melt even the hardest heart and had a special way of bringing out the protective instincts in everyone around her. Rick, who had always been gentle with children, seemed to have a particular soft spot for little Tabitha, often carrying her on his shoulders as he did his evening chores or letting her help him with simple tasks around the property. Their home had become a hub of activity and love, the kind of place where neighbors felt welcome to drop by unannounced, where the kitchen table was always set for one more, and where the sound of children's laughter echoed through the rooms from morning until night. It was a house filled with the comfortable chaos of a large, loving family, bicycles left on the front porch, toys scattered across the living room floor, the refrigerator covered with school artwork and family photos. On that fateful September evening in 2009, the family followed their usual routine. Dinner was shared around the kitchen table amid the typical chatter and gentle chaos of a household with multiple children. Homework was completed under Ruth's watchful eye, baths were given to the younger children, and bedtime stories were read in the soft glow of bedroom lamps. Rick likely spent some time reviewing plans for upcoming construction jobs or tending to the animals on their small farm, while Ruth ensured that everyone had what they needed for the night ahead. As the evening wound down, the house gradually grew quieter. The older children settled into their respective bedrooms, perhaps reading or listening to music before sleep claimed them. Little Tabitha was tucked into her bed with her favorite stuffed animal, her small hand curled around Ruth's finger as she drifted off to sleep. Rick and Ruth probably enjoyed a few quiet moments together, the kind of precious time that parents of large families treasure, before they too prepared for bed, looking forward to another day in the life they had built together. None of them could have imagined that somewhere in the darkness beyond their porch light, evil was approaching. None of them could have foreseen that their trust in their community, their faith in the basic goodness of human nature, was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. As they settled into sleep that night, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of home, they had no way of knowing that they would never see another sunrise together as a family. The man who would destroy their lives was someone they knew, someone who had been welcomed into their extended family circle, someone who should have been among their protectors rather than their destroyer. Christopher Harris had married into their family when he wed Rick's daughter Nicole, and by all external appearances, he seemed like a decent young man who was building a life with his wife and their 2 small children. But beneath the surface, Christopher harbored darkness that would soon explode into unimaginable violence. The events of that September night began not with careful planning or premeditation, but with drugs, alcohol, and the kind of poor decision-making that can spiral out of control with devastating consequences. Christopher Harris and his brother Jason had been partying hard that evening, consuming alcohol and snorting cocaine until their judgment was severely impaired and their inhibitions had completely disappeared. What started as a typical night of substance abuse gradually transformed into something much more sinister as the brothers' search for continued entertainment took increasingly dangerous turns. Under the influence of drugs and driven by base urges, the Harris brothers decided they needed female companionship to complete their evening of debauchery. They reached out to various ex-girlfriends and acquaintances, looking for someone willing to join them in their intoxicated state. When these attempts were rebuffed, as they should have been by any sensible person, most people would have simply called it a night and gone home. But the combination of cocaine, alcohol, and sexual frustration created a toxic mixture that would prove deadly. According to later testimony, it was Christopher who suggested they visit the Geurin household, specifically targeting 16-year-old Justina with the intention of sexual assault. Whether he truly believed the teenager had been flirting with him or whether this was simply a drug-fueled fantasy is unclear, but Christopher had convinced himself that Justina would be receptive to his advances. The fact that she was his sister-in-law, that she was still a child, that she lived in a house full of family members who would protect her. None of these considerations seemed to penetrate his altered state of consciousness. Jason Harris would later claim that he remained in the truck while his brother approached the house, that he was merely a reluctant witness to the horror that followed. But even if we accept his version of events, and there's reason to doubt it, his presence enabled the tragedy and his failure to intervene or seek help makes him complicit in the carnage that ensued. When Christopher approached the Geurin house in the early morning hours of September 29, 2009, he was carrying a tire iron, a weapon that would become the instrument of unspeakable brutality. Some accounts suggest he was already armed when he knocked on the door. Others indicate he retrieved the weapon from the truck after his initial interaction with Rick Geurin. Regardless of the specific sequence of events, what happened next would forever change the lives of everyone connected to this loving family. Rick Geurin, the hard-working father who had built his life around protecting and providing for his family, answered the door to find his son-in-law standing on his porch in the middle of the night. Perhaps Christopher spun some story about needing help or looking for Nicole. Perhaps he simply pushed his way inside. But whatever words were exchanged, the situation escalated quickly into violence when Christopher struck Rick with the tire iron, beginning a massacre that would claim 5 lives before the sun rose. The first blow to Rick's head would have been shocking in its suddenness and brutality. This was a man who had welcomed Christopher into his family, who had treated him with respect and kindness, who had never given him any reason for violence. But Christopher, high on drugs and driven by urges he could no longer control, had crossed a line from which there would be no return. As Rick fell to the floor of his own hallway, blood pooling around his head, he may have had just enough time to realize that his family was in mortal danger before Christopher's relentless assault continued. Ruth, hearing the commotion from the bedroom, likely rushed to investigate what was happening to her husband. Her maternal instincts would have overridden any concern for her own safety as she tried to reach Rick, to help him, to understand what was happening in her home. But Christopher's violence had unleashed something primal and unstoppable. When Ruth appeared, she too became a target, struck down with the same tire iron that had felled her husband. The woman who had brought so much laughter and warmth to this household was brutally murdered in her own home, her blood joining Rick's on the floor where they had walked together just hours before. The sounds of violence, the sickening thuds of metal against flesh and bone, the cries of pain and terror, the crash of furniture being overturned, would have awakened the children who were sleeping peacefully just moments before. 14-year-old Dylan, perhaps the first to fully understand what was happening, demonstrated remarkable courage in his attempts to protect his family. According to Jason's testimony, Dylan actually jumped out of a bedroom window in an attempt to escape, but then made the heroic decision to re-enter the house to try to save his mother and the other children. Armed with only a kitchen knife against an attacker wielding a tire iron, Dylan fought with the desperate courage of a boy trying to protect everything he held dear. But he was no match for a grown man fueled by drugs and bloodlust. Christopher turned his weapon on the teenager, striking him again and again until Dylan's young body could no longer withstand the assault. The boy who had struggled with ADHD, who had worked so hard in therapy to learn to control his impulses and channel his energy, died as a hero trying to save his family. 11-year-old Austin, the curious, thoughtful boy who had followed his father around the construction sites and dreamed of growing up to be just like him, was found in the bathroom attached to the master bedroom. Whether he had hidden there in terror or had been trying to escape when Christopher found him, Austin became another victim of the inexplicable violence that had invaded his home. His small body, dressed only in underwear, bore evidence of the savage attack that ended his young life before it had truly begun. 16-year-old Justina, the supposed object of Christopher's twisted desires, suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. Found in her bedroom with her head hanging over the edge of the bed, the beautiful teenager who should have been dreaming about prom dates and college plans instead became the victim of a violence so extreme that even hardened investigators were shaken by what they discovered. The blood that covered every surface of her room told a story of prolonged suffering that no child should ever endure. But it was the discovery of 3-year-old Tabitha that truly broke the hearts of everyone who responded to the scene. Found crumpled in a dark closet, the little girl who had been the light of the family's life was barely clinging to life, her small body bearing injuries that seemed impossible for someone so young to survive. The fact that she was still breathing when officers found her was nothing short of miraculous, but it also meant that this tiny child had endured conscious moments of terror and pain that no human being should ever experience. The scene that greeted first responders was unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. Blood covered virtually every surface, walls, ceilings, floors, creating a tableau of violence so extreme that it challenged their ability to process what they were seeing. The handprint found on the bathroom vanity, the shoe print outside the house, the knife at the bottom of the porch steps. Each piece of evidence told part of the story of a family's final moments, but none of it could adequately convey the human cost of Christopher Harris's actions. 10-year-old Satan Lundstrom, the neighbor boy who discovered the scene while coming to show off his new bicycle, would carry the image of blood on the porch for the rest of his life. The innocence of childhood was shattered not just for him but for every child in the community who suddenly realized that evil could invade even the safest seeming places. The investigation that followed would reveal the cold, calculated nature of Christopher's cover-up attempts. After committing the murders, he had calmly disposed of evidence, throwing his bloody shoes and the tire iron into a ditch as he and Jason drove away from the scene. He had then proceeded to an arranged sexual encounter with another woman, acting completely normal as if he hadn't just brutally murdered 5 people and left a toddler for dead. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Christopher's palm print at the scene, the DNA on the murder weapon, the testimony of multiple witnesses who could place him in the area at the time of the murders, all of it pointed to his guilt. But perhaps the most damning evidence was his own behavior in the aftermath. When he learned that little Tabitha had survived, his first instinct wasn't relief or concern for the child's welfare, it was fear that she might be able to identify him as the killer. Jason Harris's decision to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence provided the final pieces of the puzzle. His testimony, despite its inconsistencies and self-serving nature, confirmed what the physical evidence had already established. Christopher Harris had murdered the Geurin family in cold blood, motivated by drugs, sexual desire, and a complete disregard for human life. The trial that followed was a painful ordeal for everyone who had loved the Geurin family. Nicole Harris, who had initially defended her husband against the accusations, was forced to confront the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The woman who had lost her father, stepmother, and siblings in one night also had to grapple with the reality that the man she had married, the father of her children, was responsible for destroying her family. But perhaps the most powerful moment of the entire legal proceeding came when 7-year-old Tabitha, the sole survivor of the massacre, delivered her victim impact statement. Standing before the court with the scars of her ordeal still visible, this brave little girl looked directly at the man who had tried to kill her and said, "I am 7 and it still breaks my heart. I wish you were dead and my brother, sister, and mommy and daddy were alive. You don't sneak up on other people. You have to say sorry because do you know how badly that broke my heart?" Her words, delivered with the simple honesty that only a child can muster, captured the true cost of Christopher Harris's actions better than any prosecutor's argument or forensic report ever could. This was not just a case about DNA evidence and tire irons and shoe prints. It was about a family destroyed, about children who would never grow up, about a little girl who would have to live with physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. The 5 consecutive life sentences that Christopher Harris received seemed almost inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. No punishment could bring back Rick, Ruth, Austin, Dylan, and Justina. No amount of time behind bars could undo the trauma inflicted on Tabitha or heal the wounds suffered by the extended family and community members who had loved the Geurins. Tabitha's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The little girl who had been found barely alive in a closet not only survived her massive injuries but eventually thrived in the loving care of her sister Nicole. The head trauma she had suffered had the unexpected mercy of erasing her memories of that horrible night, allowing her to grow up without the burden of conscious recollection of the violence she had endured. The community of Beason, forever changed by the tragedy, created a memorial playground in honor of Austin, Dylan, and Justina, a place where their spirits could be remembered through the laughter and joy of other children at play. It was a fitting tribute to young lives cut short, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, love and memory can create something beautiful. The Geurin family massacre stands as a stark reminder that evil can strike anywhere, that trust can be betrayed in the most devastating ways, and that the people we welcome into our families can sometimes harbor darkness we never suspect. But it also serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love to endure even the most terrible losses, and the courage that ordinary people can display in extraordinary circumstances. Dylan's heroic attempt to save his family, Tabitha's incredible survival and recovery, Nicole's strength in rebuilding her life after losing everything. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered alongside the horror. They remind us that while evil may win temporary victories, it never has the final word in the human story. In the end, the Beason Massacre was more than just a true crime case. It was a tragedy that tore apart a family, shattered a community's sense of security, and reminded us all of how precious and fragile our loved ones truly are. The Geurin family deserved to see many more sunrises together, to